The gavel came down so hard it split the edge of Judge Harlan Pruitt's oak table, and in the ringing silence that followed, every soul packed into the Redemption Creek Town Hall held their breath. "You will hand over that deed, Miss Wells." Elias Croft's voice did not ask. It commanded, smooth as river stone and twice as cold. He stood at the front of the room in his tailored black frock coat, silver watch chain catching the lantern light, 3 hired lawyers arranged behind him like a wall of starched collateral. He was the biggest cattleman in the New Mexico territory, and he had never once in his 52 years of living been told no by anyone who could not afford the consequence. Martha Wells did not move. She stood at the opposite table, 5 feet 4 inches of absolute stillness, her dark hair pinned back beneath a plain calico bonnet, her hands flat on the table's surface in front of her. Those hands were steady, not the steadiness of someone who was not frightened, the steadiness of someone who had decided, somewhere far back before this moment, that fear was a luxury she simply could not carry. "Your claim to the Millbrook tributary is void," Croft continued, nodding to the man on his left, a lawyer named Thatcher who wore spectacles and a permanent expression of bored superiority. "Mr. Thatcher has filed the county replacement easement with the territorial court in Santa Fe. The original 1879 Wells contract was never properly witnessed under territorial statute. Your signature alone carries no legal standing." A murmur moved through the packed hall. 40-odd residents of Redemption Creek had crowded in, farmers and shopkeepers and women with children on their hips, all of them knowing that if Martha Wells lost access to the Millbrook tributary, every small farm on the south side of the valley lost its irrigation water too. Croft's cattle operation had been creeping east for 2 years, buying out neighbors one dry summer at a time. This was the last stand, and every person in that room understood it. Martha looked at Thatcher, then she looked at Croft. Her voice, when it came, was perfectly level. "Mr. Croft, I appreciate your confidence in Mr. Thatcher's filing. I imagine it took considerable effort." She reached down into the leather satchel at her feet. "But before Judge Pruitt rules on any replacement easement, I believe he will want to see the original witness copy of the 1879 contract." She laid it on the table. The document was old but immaculate, the paper a deep cream color, folded along precise creases that had clearly been opened and refolded many times over many careful years. Croft's eyes narrowed. Thatcher's mouth went slack, and standing at the back of the room, leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded and his hat pushed back on his head, Marshal Hayes watched Martha Wells with an expression that had just shifted from watchful neutrality into something else entirely. Something that looked, if anyone had been paying attention to him, rather than to the document she now unfolded, a great deal like astonishment. The contract bore 2 witness signatures. The notarial seal of Territorial Justice Edmund Farrow, dated April 14, 1879. And beneath it in a second firm hand, the signature of one Reverend Thomas Aldridge of Redemption Creek, still living, still residing 4 blocks east on Church Street. "The statute requires 1 qualified witness," Martha said quietly. "I have 2, both living, both available to testify this morning if required." Croft's jaw tightened. The room erupted. Judge Pruitt's replacement gavel, borrowed hastily from his own belt knife handle, cracked against the fractured table. "Order." I said order in this hall. But Marshal Hayes, who had ridden in that morning as territorial marshal on what he'd been told was a routine property dispute, was no longer leaning casually against the doorframe. He had straightened to his full 6 feet 2 inches, and his dark eyes had not left Martha Wells since the moment she produced that document, and the thing moving through his chest was not something he had any prepared category for. It would take him longer than this morning to understand it, but it had already begun. 3 weeks earlier, Redemption Creek had been just another name on Marshal Hayes's assignment ledger. The territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe had been fielding complaints from the valley for 6 months, small irregularities at first, A boundary dispute here. A well mysteriously gone dry there. A deed that turned up incorrectly filed in the county records. None of it dramatic enough to warrant immediate attention. All of it, in retrospect, pointing in the same direction. Hayes had ridden in on a Tuesday, the kind of October Tuesday in 1882, New Mexico, where the sky was that impossible blue that made you feel the world was larger than your problems, and the cottonwood trees along the creek road had gone gold overnight. He had 2 weeks of hard travel behind him and a week's worth of stubble on his jaw, and the first thing he did when he reached Redemption Creek was what he always did. He went to the person who knew everything. In most frontier towns, that person was the barkeeper. In Redemption Creek, everyone he asked pointed him to the same place. "You want to understand this valley, you talk to Martha Wells," said the stable hand who took his horse. "She's the healer, she knows everybody." The healer. Hayes had repeated this with the mildest skepticism. He was not a man given to strong opinions about medicine women, having known 3 or 4 in his time, some sensible, some questionable. "Where does she practice?" "Down on Sycamore Street." "The house with the blue door and the herb garden. You cannot miss it." He had very nearly missed it, because he was looking for a sign, and there was no sign, only a deep blue door in a whitewashed adobe wall and a garden that ran the full length of the front of the property, organized in a way that suggested a precise and purposeful mind. He had noted this without quite acknowledging why he was noting it, and knocked. Martha Wells opened the door herself. She was younger than he had expected, though later he would reflect that he had not formed any real expectation. 28 or 29, he guessed, with dark eyes that assessed him in about half a second with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to people arriving at her door in states of need. She wore a clean work dress, sage green, practical but not shabby, and she had ink on her right index finger and a smell about her of dried sage and something sharper, medicinal, that he could not immediately identify. "Marshal," she said, taking in his badge and his build and his travel-worn condition with equal measure. "You had better come in. I expected someone from the territorial office about 3 weeks ago." That was the first time she surprised him. He sat in her front room, which served as both a consultation space and what appeared to be a working laboratory of some kind. Shelves of labeled glass jars along one wall, a work table bearing a mortar and pestle, a small scale, bundles of dried plant material hanging from the ceiling rafters. There was a bookshelf that he noticed with genuine interest, not the 1 or 2 volumes a frontier household might possess, but a full shelf, medical texts and law books, and what appeared to be 2 volumes of territorial statute. "You've been tracking the Croft situation," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I have been documenting it," Martha replied, setting a cup of coffee in front of him with the matter-of-fact hospitality of someone who ran a household alone and ran it efficiently. "For 14 months. Would you like to see my records?" He stared at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I would." What she produced over the next 2 hours redefined the afternoon. She had kept a journal, meticulous and cross-referenced, of every property transaction, every water claim dispute, every deed irregularity, every mysterious illness that had preceded a family's decision to sell their land to Croft's operation at below market price. There were dates, names, dollar figures, and in several cases, medical notes that described symptoms consistent with contaminated water. She had drawn a map of the valley, hand-drawn with genuine cartographic competence, showing the watershed and every property boundary and every date on which a boundary had shifted in Croft's favor. Hayes read in silence for a long time. The coffee went cold. Outside, the afternoon light moved from blue to gold. "You put this together yourself," he said finally. "I did. Have you shared this with anyone?" "Judge Prout." He acknowledged receipt and did nothing. Her voice was matter-of-fact about this, carrying no particular bitterness, just the flat weight of someone who had been disappointed by institutions often enough to have incorporated it into her calculations. "I sent a copy to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe 4 months ago. I received a form letter of acknowledgement. That form letter may have been what prompted my assignment, Hayes said, though no one in the office told me the source had done this level of preparation. Would it have changed your assignment? No, but it changes my approach. He looked at her directly. Miss Wells, I have worked property disputes across 3 territories, and I have never seen documentation like this from a private citizen. Where did you learn to do this? For the first time, something shifted in her composure, not vulnerability exactly, but a glimpse of the person inside the professional efficiency. My mother was a midwife and healer. My father was a circuit court clerk. I learned medicine from one and record-keeping from the other, and I learned early that in places like this, the two are not as separate as people think. Someone poisons your water. You need a doctor and a lawyer both. Hayes had been in the territories long enough to recognize the specific kind of resourcefulness that grew in people who had been forced, by circumstance or by injustice, to become their own whole system of support. He recognized it, and he respected it, and he felt something else alongside the respect that he chose not to examine at that moment. "All right," he said, closing the journal with care and sliding it back across the table. "Tell me everything from the beginning." She told him. It took the rest of the afternoon and part of the evening, and by the time the story was laid out in full, Hayes understood that what he was looking at was not a routine property dispute. Elias Croft had been systematically dismantling the small farming community of Redemption Creek South Valley for 2 years. The method was elegant in its brutality. First, acquire the water rights. Without water, the farms died. Without the farms, the families left. Without the families, the land sold cheap. And if a property holder was particularly stubborn about selling, Croft had demonstrated a willingness to accelerate their difficulties in ways that were difficult to prove. Martha Wells was the most stubborn property holder remaining. She had not sold. She would not sell. And Croft had recently discovered that the most effective way to break her was not through her own property, but through her water contract, the contract that secured her access to the Millbrook tributary and, by extension, secured the irrigation water for 8 other families who had informal easement rights through her land. He filed a challenge with the county on the grounds that the original contract was improperly witnessed, Martha explained. His lawyers found a territorial statute from 1876 that requires either a notary or a qualified legal witness for water contracts above a certain acreage. The original contract from 1879 was filed with only my mother's signature. But you produced a witness copy. I have the original witness copy, she said carefully, and there was something in her emphasis that made Hayes look at her again. My mother was meticulous. When she filed the contract, she kept the notarized original in her possession and filed a plain copy with the county. The county copy is what Croft's lawyers found when they searched the records. It is the one without the witness signatures. And the notarized original has been in your possession this entire time. In a tin box inside the wall cavity behind my hearth, Martha said. My mother put it there in 1880 when Croft first started buying up land. She said, and I remember her exact words because she told me 3 times, "Martha, the man who wants your water will send someone after the paper first." She was right. My house was searched last spring while I was delivering a baby on the Perez farm. Whoever searched it was professional and careful. They found nothing. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Your mother sounds like an exceptional woman. She was. A pause, brief and contained. She died of fever in 1881. I have been running the practice alone since then. There it was. The thing that explained the self-sufficiency, the prepared efficiency, the way she moved through the world as though every contingency had already been accounted for. She had learned it by necessity, from a woman who had clearly seen far enough ahead to try to protect her daughter, even from beyond the eventual horizon. Hayes left her house that evening with a copy of her documentation under his arm, her permission to share it with Judge Prout, and the distinct and unusual sensation that he had been, for the first time in a very long career of investigating difficult situations, thoroughly outprepared by the person he had come to help. He did not sleep well that night in the room above the Redemption Creek Hotel. This was not unusual for him. He rarely slept well anywhere. But the quality of his wakefulness that night was different from his customary alertness, less strategic, more circular, returning without clear purpose to the image of Martha Wells laying out her documentation on the table between them with the contained intensity of someone who had been waiting a long time to have it properly witnessed. He thought about her mother's instruction: hide the paper. The man who wants your water will send someone after the paper first. In the morning, he began his own investigation, corroborating what he could from Martha's records with his own queries to the county clerk, the land office, and the 2 witnesses she had named on the original contract. Both Reverend Aldridge and Territorial Justice Edmund Farrow, now retired and living in Albuquerque, confirmed their signatures. Farrow's confirmation, obtained by telegraph, arrived within a day and was unambiguous. He remembered the Wells contract. He had notarized it personally. He could produce his notarial register if required. Croft, meanwhile, was moving fast. His lawyers had filed the replacement easement in Santa Fe, and the hearing before Judge Pruitt had been set for a date that gave Martha minimal time to prepare a formal legal response. Hayes suspected this was intentional. Croft had the resources to move the machinery of territorial law at a speed that overwhelmed private citizens, and he had used that advantage before. Hayes went to see Croft on the 3rd day. The Croft Ranch headquarters was an impressive operation, 12 miles north of Redemption Creek in a wide valley that caught every breeze coming off the mountains. The main house was territorial adobe but large, with a wraparound porch and glass windows, and a general air of established prosperity. Hayes had seen similar operations across the territory, and he recognized the specific flavor of wealth that had grown fast enough to be hungry and old enough to believe it was permanent. Croft received him in the ranch office, a room full of maps and leather-bound ledgers, and the particular smell of money and tobacco. He was a broad man, not tall but solid, with white hair and a weathered face and eyes that had the flat, speculative quality of a man who assessed everything in terms of its negotiable value. "Marshal Hayes," he said, with the hospitality of someone who had no reason to fear a territorial marshal because he had never yet met one he could not manage. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I am looking into the property dispute situation in the South Valley," Hayes said pleasantly, taking the offered seat and declining the offered whiskey. "I have been reviewing the documentation." "There is no dispute," Croft said, with equal pleasantness. "The Wells woman's water contract was improperly filed. My lawyers have corrected the situation through proper legal channels. The hearing before Judge Pruitt is simply a formality." "I appreciate your confidence," Hayes said, in exactly the tone Martha had used with him 3 days before in her front room, and he noticed the echo of it only after the words were out of his mouth. "But I would like to understand the history a little better. Would you walk me through the timeline of acquisitions in the South Valley over the past 2 years? Croft walked him through it. The version he told was smooth and consistent and entirely legal on its surface. A series of willing sales, fair prices paid, properties acquired from families who had simply found frontier farming too difficult and preferred to take the cash. Hayes listened to all of it, asked polite questions, took notes in the small leather journal he carried, and learned very little that Martha had not already documented. What he learned about Croft himself was more useful. The man was not panicked. He was not even particularly concerned. He had, Hayes concluded, genuine confidence that the legal mechanism he had set in motion would succeed. Which meant either that he did not know about the notarized original, or that he had been told the search of Martha's house had been successful. When Hayes rose to leave, Croft said, in the tone of a man offering a friendly advisory, "Marshal, I want you to understand something. The Wells woman is not what she appears. She has been stirring up the valley farmers against my operation for months with claims that have no legal basis. She is, with respect, a frontier healer with an inflated notion of her own importance. The South Valley will be better managed under a unified operation. These families will get fair compensation and the freedom to move somewhere better suited to their circumstances. Hayes looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate your perspective," he said. And then he left. On the ride back to town, he thought about the word Martha had used without drama or self-pity when she had described the families who had already sold. Displaced. Not gone on to better things. Displaced. The specific vocabulary of someone who understood what it looked like when people were pushed off land that was theirs and told to be grateful for the push. He also thought about what Croft had said about her. She is not what she appears. He had said it as a caution, as a warning, as the kind of thing powerful men said about inconvenient women to preemptively discredit them. But as Hayes turned it over, riding through the gold and blue of the New Mexico afternoon, it struck him as, ironically, the most accurate thing Elias Croft had said all day. Martha Wells was not what she appeared. She appeared to be a frontier healer, practical and self-contained, living alone in her blue-doored adobe house with her herb garden and her medical texts. But she was also, it turned out, something considerably more complicated. She was the person who had been quietly holding the South Valley together, not just medically but strategically, for longer than anyone outside of it would ever know. He called on her again the following evening, professedly to share what he had learned from his investigation, which was true, and for no other reason which was less true. She was at her work table when he arrived, grinding something in the mortar with the focused attention of someone in the middle of a process that could not be interrupted without consequence. She gestured him to a chair without looking up and said, "Give me 3 minutes." He gave her 3 minutes. He watched her work. She was precise in a way that reminded him of the best trackers he had known, people who were so comfortable in their specific competence that there was nothing performative about it. She was not showing him how skilled she was. She was simply being skilled, the way a river is simply moving. When she finished and covered the mortar with a cloth and washed her hands at the basin, she looked at him and said, "You went to see Croft. How did you know? Tom Bauer saw your horse at the Croft Ranch Road turnoff. Tom tells me things," a slight pause. "Tom tells me most things. It is useful. Do you have an informant network?" He asked this genuinely without condescension. A flicker of something, not quite amusement but adjacent to it, moved across her face. "I have patience. People tell their healers things. It is the nature of the relationship." Hayes nodded. "What did Croft's search party look for when they came through your house?" She looked at him sharply. "You know about that." I made an inference. She was quiet for a moment, weighing something. Then she said they were looking for the original contract. They knew it existed because Territorial Justice Pharaoh's notarial register, which is a public record, lists it. They found the box my mother used for correspondence. They found letters, receipts, old medical records. They did not find the tin box. Because it is inside the wall. Because it is inside the wall. She looked at him steadily. "How did you know it was a search party rather than a common thief?" "Nothing was taken. A common thief in a healer's house takes the morphine preparation and the cash box. A search party with a specific target finds nothing and leaves everything else intact to avoid drawing attention." The quality of the silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. He had passed some kind of assessment. He understood this without her saying so. "You are more perceptive than I expected," she said. "You expected less." "I expected a territorial marshal who would take my documentation politely, return to Santa Fe, and file a report that would be reviewed in 6 to 8 months. It is what happened the last 3 times I engaged with the territorial system." "How many times have you engaged with the territorial system on this issue?" 4 times, counting you. Flat. "Matter of fact. The land office twice, Judge Prout once, and now you." Hayes felt a particular kind of productive anger that he generally found useful and tried to keep professional. "I am not going to file a report that takes 6 to 8 months. "I know," she said, and then more quietly, "I know you are not." Something passed between them in that moment, across the work table and the smell of sage and the lantern light, that neither of them acknowledged. He was not a man who acknowledged things before he was certain of them. She was not a woman who acknowledged things before she was certain they were safe. But it was there. It had been there probably since the first afternoon. Over the following 2 weeks, as the hearing date approached, Hayes and Martha built their case in parallel. He worked the official channels, telegraphed to Santa Fe, formal interviews with the county clerk and the 2 witnesses, an examination of Croft's acquisition records that revealed 3 instances of suspicious deed filing that he forwarded to the Territorial Attorney General's office. She worked her channels, gathering sworn written statements from South Valley families about conditions on their former properties, documenting the timeline of water availability changes, preparing the contract and its supporting evidence for presentation to Judge Pruitt. They met every second or third day in the late afternoon at her house. The meetings were professional. They talked about the case. They drank her coffee, which was better than anything Hayes had been served in the hotel or the saloon, and they worked through the documentation together, checking each other's logic, identifying weaknesses, preparing for the arguments Croft's lawyers would make. It was, in the aggregate, the most practically useful professional collaboration Hayes had been part of in 10 years of territorial law enforcement. It was also, though he approached this acknowledgement with his characteristic caution, the most personally interesting month he could remember. She was not easy company in the way that meant effortless. She was direct to the edge of bluntness. She was entirely uninterested in social performance, and she was constitutionally incapable of pretending to be less informed than she was for the comfort of someone else's ego. She had, Hayes suspected, spent enough years being underestimated that she had stopped accommodating it. But she was also, when the professional apparatus relaxed slightly, genuinely funny, with a dry humor that appeared without announcement and disappeared with equal suddenness. She had strong opinions about things that surprised him: the ethics of water allocation, the territorial school system's reach, the migratory patterns of the birds that came through the valley in October. She had read more than almost anyone he had met in the territories. She had thought more. On the 6th meeting, he arrived to find her in the herb garden in the fading afternoon, on her knees in the dirt, transplanting something small and determined-looking from a clay pot into the ground. She looked up when she heard him at the gate and said without preamble, "Do you know anything about Olacy?" "Olive family," he said, and she blinked, which was the closest he had yet seen her come to being caught off guard. "You know your plant families. I spent 2 years in the Arizona territory. The Tohono O'odham people near Tucson used to trade with a Mexican family whose ranch had desert olive. I learned a little." He opened the gate and came into the garden. "What are you transplanting?" "Wild olive. It is a long project. They take years to establish." She settled back on her heels and looked at the small plant with something in her expression that was entirely private and entirely unguarded, just for a moment. "My mother started this garden. I am trying to finish what she planned." He crouched beside her, not touching the plant, not offering help she had not asked for, just looking at it with her for a moment. The light was doing something particular to the garden, long and golden, and the air smelled of turned earth and the herb beds. "You miss her," he said, not a question. "Every day, simple, unapologetic. She was the person who understood the most about what I was doing and why. It is different carrying something without the person who helped you start it." He did not say anything immediately, because he understood this and had no words that improved on the silence. His own losses were private things: a father who had died of a mining accident in Colorado when Hayes was 14, a partner in the marshal service who had been killed in a claim dispute 6 years ago, a particular variety of knowing what it meant to continue a direction that someone else had helped you find. After a moment he said, "She hid the contract." "She did. She knew it would matter." Martha looked at him. "She knew it would matter to me. That is why she did it." A pause. "And because it was right. Because the contract was real and the water was ours, and she believed that the truth of a thing outlasts the attempt to erase it." Hayes thought about this on the walk back to the hotel, and in the night that followed, and on several occasions over the subsequent days, with a frequency that he eventually recognized as meaning he was thinking about Martha Wells rather than about any abstract principle, and that the document and its history had become inseparable in his mind from the person who had kept it. The hearing convened on a Thursday morning in mid-October 1882. The town hall was so full that people stood along the walls and crowded in the doorway. Hayes had positioned himself at the back, where he could see the room and its exits, which was habit, but he had also, with deliberate honesty, positioned himself where he could see Martha's face as well as the judge's. Croft's lawyer Thatcher led for 20 minutes with the technical argument, the territorial statute, the county records, the replacement easement. He was polished and precise and clearly anticipated no substantive rebuttal. Beside him, Croft sat with the composed patience of someone watching a foregone conclusion being processed. Martha's appointed lawyer, a man named Cooper who was competent but young and visibly outgunned by Thatcher's experience, began to speak and then paused when Martha touched his arm. He sat down. She stood. There was a murmur in the room. Judge Prout looked over his spectacles. "Miss Wells, Mr. Cooper is your legal representative." "Mr. Cooper has my full confidence," Martha said. "I would like to speak briefly before he presents our formal response with the court's permission." Prout looked at Croft, which was, Hayes noted with cold precision, exactly the wrong instinct for a judge. Then he looked back at Martha and said, "Briefly, Miss Wells." And Martha Wells said, quietly and with absolute precision, "Before Judge Prout rules on any replacement easement, I believe he will want to see the original witnessed copy of the 1879 contract," and laid it on the table. The room's response was immediate and total, a sound like a wave breaking that contained within it 3 months of suppressed fear and 2 years of accumulated resentment, and the very specific relief of people who had stopped expecting to win and had just been proven wrong. Croft's composure cracked, just slightly, around the eyes. Thatcher took off his spectacles and put them back on. The third lawyer, the one Hayes had not caught the name of, actually reached forward and took up the contract to look at it, and Martha watched him do so with the calm of someone who has no objection to scrutiny, because everything about the document is exactly what it is stated to be. Hayes pushed off the doorframe and walked forward through the room, not urgently, with the measured, unhurried movement of a man who had done what he had come to do and was now formalizing it. He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and produced his own document, the telegraph confirmation from retired territorial Justice Edmund Farrow in Albuquerque, and set it on the judge's table. "Marshal Hayes," Prout said, startled. "What is this?" "Corroborating confirmation from one of the witnesses named on the contract, Your Honor. Justice Farrow confirms his notarial seal and signature and states that his register entry for April 14, 1879 records the Wells Water contract by name. He is prepared to provide a sworn affidavit if required." Hayes looked at Thatcher and then at Croft with the specific measured neutrality of a federal officer who has found what he came looking for and does not need to be dramatic about it. "I have also forwarded to the Territorial Attorney General's office documentation relating to 3 instances of deed irregularity in the South Valley acquisitions over the past 2 years. That is a separate matter and a separate process, but I thought it was worth noting for the court's awareness." Croft stood up. "Judge, this is a fabricated intervention by an officer who has exceeded his mandate." Hayes looked at him steadily. "I have not exceeded anything, Mr. Croft. A federal marshal investigating property irregularities in a territorial jurisdiction is the mandate." "The original contract is authentic," Martha said into the charged silence, and her voice had that same level quality she had maintained through the entire confrontation, but underneath it now, Hayes heard something that was not professional stillness. It was exhaustion and relief, and something fiercer than either. "My mother signed it. 2 qualified witnesses attested to it. It has been in lawful storage since 1879. No replacement easement filed in 1882 supersedes it. She looked at Croft directly. This is my water. It has always been my water. And the families who draw their irrigation from the Millbrook tributary through my land have an existing right of easement that I granted and intend to maintain. Judge Pruitt examined the contract for a very long minute. He examined the Faro telegraph confirmation. He looked at Reverend Aldridge, who had come forward from the crowd and was nodding with the solemn confirmation of a man who had signed something 40 years ago and remembered it clearly. He looked at Croft and Thatcher and made the calculation of a man who had perhaps been leaning the wrong direction for reasons that were now subject to federal scrutiny. The replacement easement filing is denied, Pruitt said. Original Wells water contract of 1879, witnessed and notarized, is affirmed as the controlling document. Mr. Croft, the Millbrook tributary water rights remain with the Wells property. Any future challenge must address the contract as filed, including both witness signatures. He picked up his belt knife and tapped it on the table because the gavel was ruined. This hearing is concluded. The room came apart at the seams with sound. People were embracing. 3 women were crying. Old man Perez, whose farm had been under threat for 8 months, put his face in his hands for a moment, and then looked up with an expression of such naked gratitude that Hayes had to look away. He looked at Martha instead. She was standing at her table, both hands flat on the surface again as she had stood when he first saw her, but the stillness now was different. The tension had gone out of it. She was very slightly trembling, not from weakness, but from the release of something that had been held at high pressure for a very long time. Croft's lawyers were gathering their papers with the controlled rapidity of men managing a client who had not expected to be managed. Croft himself was speaking in low, hard tones to Thatcher, and Hayes watched him with the attention he always paid to men who had just lost something they had been certain they would win and were already calculating their next move. But that was tomorrow's problem. The hearing was over. The contract had held. Hayes moved through the crowd toward Martha. People kept stopping him, shaking his hand, a level of gratitude that he redirected as efficiently as he could. It was her work, her documentation, her mother's foresight that had won the day. He said this to several people before he reached her table. She was packing the contract back into its leather satchel with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something irreplaceable. She looked up when he stopped beside her. "I told you," she said, and her voice was the quietest it had been all morning, "that the truth outlasts the attempt to erase it." "You did," he said. "I believed you." Something passed between them again, the same current that had moved through the work table and the herb garden and every afternoon meeting in her front room. But this time neither of them looked away. "I need to see to the Kellerman children," she said after a moment. "Tom Kellerman's youngest has been running a fever for 2 days, and I have not been able to check on her with all of this." Of course, he did not ask if she would be all right. She was clearly and entirely all right. "I will be in town for a few more days completing my report. If Croft makes any further moves, I want to know about it." "You will know about it," she said. And then, as she picked up the satchel and turned to go, she paused and looked back at him with those dark, assessing eyes that had been assessing him from the first moment. "Thank you, Marshal Hayes, for coming when you did, and for treating what I brought you as real." He wanted to say several things. He said, "Thank you for having it." She left. He watched her go, moving through the crowd with the same unhurried, purposeful movement she brought to everything, stopping to squeeze Emma Perez's hand, saying something to Reverend Aldridge that made the old man smile, already moving toward the next thing she was needed for, already carrying the valley on shoulders that did not make theater of the weight. Hayes stood in the emptying town hall with his own hands in his coat pockets and acknowledged, with the thoroughness he applied to all significant facts, that he was in considerable trouble. He stayed in Redemption Creek for 2 more weeks to complete his formal report and ensure Croft made no immediate retaliatory moves, which was not the full reason he stayed, but was a sufficient professional justification. During those 2 weeks, he saw Martha Wells 7 more times, because there were legitimate reasons for a territorial marshal to consult with a key witness and documentation source, and he was at peace with the fact that the legitimate reasons did not fully account for the frequency. The first time, 2 days after the hearing, she came to him. She appeared at the hotel at 7 in the morning with a jar of something amber-colored and a direct expression. "You were favoring your left shoulder yesterday," she said. "You have an old injury there. The cold is getting into it." He stared at her. "I did not favor it noticeably." "You favored it noticeably to someone who observes how people carry their bodies. That is my profession." She held out the jar. "This is an arnica preparation. You apply it at night. It will not fix the underlying damage, but it will reduce the inflammation." He took the jar. "Thank you. You are welcome. I also wanted to tell you that Croft dismissed 2 of his South Valley foremen yesterday. The word is that they are the ones who searched my house. I thought you should know. The dismissal covers his tracks." "Yes. But Tom Bauer saw it happen and can attest to the timing. I have written it down." Of course she had written it down. He smiled, which was something he did infrequently and which had the effect, apparently, of temporarily recalibrating whatever expression Martha Wells kept as her default. She looked at him for a moment in a way that was slightly different from her usual assessment. Then she said, "The arnica works best if you actually use it," and left. He used it. His shoulder was considerably better within 3 days, which was not the reason he thought about her that week, but which added a dimension. The second time, he went to her, with the ostensible purpose of confirming a timeline detail in her documentation, and the actual additional purpose of having someone intelligent to talk to. She was with a patient when he arrived, a young woman named Rosa who was recent from Mexico and frightened, and Martha settled her with a quiet competence that mixed medical attention with the specific consideration of a person who understood that fear was part of what needed treating. Hayes waited in the front room and looked at her bookshelf. She had the 2 volumes of territorial statute that he had noticed on his first visit, well thumbed, with paper bookmarks at what appeared to be multiple relevant passages. She had a medical pharmacology text that was, he noted, 3 years more current than the one the territorial doctor in Santa Fe kept on his desk. She had, slightly surprisingly, Shakespeare, a single collected volume with a broken spine that suggested actual use rather than decoration. He was looking at the Shakespeare when she came back. "A Midsummer Night's Dream," he said, because it was the page it was open to. "My father read it to me when I was 7, she said. "I have read it at least once a year since then. I am not sure why. It is not my favorite." "What is your favorite?" She looked at him as though the question was unexpected, not because it was inappropriate but because it was genuinely curious. People did not always ask her what she preferred. "The Tempest," she said. "A woman on an island who knows everything about it and a man who arrives and has to learn." He looked at her for a moment with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable, and which he had been managing carefully for 3 weeks. "I should like to discuss that sometime," he said, "when the documentation questions are resolved." "I should like that too," she said, and the simplicity of it, no performance, no coyness, no social decorating of a direct thing, was precisely what he should have expected from her, and was nonetheless affecting in a way that he felt under his sternum. They talked for 3 hours, not about the case but about other things, and the evening moved through blue to purple outside the window, and at some point she made supper, not an invitation, just an action, putting a pot on the stove with the naturalness of someone who was feeding both of them, because it was time to eat and they were both there. And he sat at her kitchen table and ate the best meal he had had in months, and talked to her about Colorado and the Tohono O'odham and the territorial school system and Shakespeare. And something in the evening had the quality of something beginning rather than continuing, which was a quality he could feel in his bones by this point, and was no longer pretending otherwise. When he left, standing at the blue door in the October dark, she said, "Your report will take you back to Santa Fe." "It will." A pause. I expect to return to this district. The Attorney General's office will likely pursue the deed irregularity case. It will require local coordination. I expect it will, she said. I intend to manage that coordination personally. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes in the lamplight from the doorway, and what he saw in them was not just the assessment he had been catalogued by since the first day, but something warmer and less professional and equally unperformed. "Safe travel, Marshal Hayes," she said. "Miss Wells," he said, and put his hat on and walked back to the hotel with the kind of purposeful feeling that he associated with having correctly identified the most important fact in a complex situation. He returned to Santa Fe and submitted his report, which was thorough and which landed with sufficient weight to prompt the Attorney General's office to open a formal investigation into Croft's South Valley acquisitions. It was not the swift resolution Martha had earned through 2 years of documentation, but it was the beginning of one, a real one, with federal teeth. He was back in Redemption Creek 6 weeks later. He told himself this was about the ongoing investigation, which was true but not complete. He tied his horse at the stable, greeted the stable hand who had first directed him to the blue door, and walked down Sycamore Street in the December cold with a small package under his arm. Martha answered his knock in her work dress, ink on her right finger again, the same sage green that he had catalogued without meaning to on his first day. She looked at him for a moment and then she stepped back from the door. "I have coffee," she said. "Come in." The package was a book he had found in Santa Fe, a new medical text on botanical pharmacology that the bookseller had told him was the most current available. He set it on her work table. She picked it up and looked at it for a long moment. He watched her face. "This is the Park Davis publication," she said, "from November. I wrote to the publisher in September requesting notification of the printing date." She looked up. "I was planning to send away for it." "Now you do not have to," he said. She looked at him with those eyes, and what was in them now was clear enough that all his careful cataloging and professional management and strategic patience arrived, simultaneously and without ceremony, at its conclusion. "Marshal," she said, using his name rather than his title for the first time, and the difference was not small. "Martha," he said, and crossed the room to where she was standing. He kissed her first, or she kissed him. It was not entirely distinguishable, the way it sometimes is when two people have been moving toward the same moment from opposite directions and arrive at the same time. What it was certain. The way her hand came up to the front of his coat, certain. The way he kept it careful and present and completely honest, no performance in either direction. When they separated, she looked at him with the direct assessment she brought to all significant things, and what she found there appeared to satisfy it. "You are staying for Christmas," she said. It was not quite a question. "If you will have me," he said. "I will have you," she said, and went back to the work table and picked up the book again, this time with a brightness in her face that was entirely new and entirely right. He stayed for Christmas. It was, by any objective measure, the best Christmas of his adult life, which had contained several reasonable ones and a few rather bleak ones, and nothing that had prepared him for the particular experience of spending it with Martha Wells, who marked it by making a dinner that included 3 preparations from different culinary traditions she had learned from Valley families, inviting Reverend Aldridge and Old Man Perez and his wife and 2 of the South Valley families to share it, and producing from somewhere a bottle of very good brandy that she said her mother had been saving for a particular occasion. "What occasion?" he asked. "She did not specify," Martha said. "I think she trusted that I would know when it arrived." He looked at her across the table, in the candlelight, surrounded by the people she had fought for and helped and been the fixed point of through 2 hard years, and he knew exactly what occasion Catherine Wells had been saving it for, and felt the familiar tightening in the chest that he had decided some weeks ago to stop managing and simply allow. The formal investigation into Croft's operations progressed through the winter. In February 1883, The Territorial Attorney General's office secured a judgment that voided 2 of the 3 questionable South Valley deed transfers and ordered compensation to the families who had been displaced. The third was more complex, involving a willing sale that had been preceded by circumstances difficult to prove as coercive, but the family in question used the judgment's momentum to negotiate a return to their property on favorable terms. Elias Croft did not go to prison. The law of 1882, New Mexico Territory, was not constructed to easily imprison men of his standing for what could be characterized as aggressive business practices. But his operation was constrained, his expansion stopped, and the judgment went into the territorial record in a way that would follow him. He retreated to his main ranch operation, reduced to the scope he had held before he began dismantling the South Valley, and the families whose wells had mysteriously gone dry found that the problem resolved itself. Martha documented all of this with the same meticulous care she had brought to everything, and the documentation went to the Territorial Land Office as a historical record, because she understood that power has a long memory, and the people who suffer it need a longer one. Hayes was in Redemption Creek for 2 weeks of every 6 through that winter, and in March he asked Martha to walk with him along the Millbrook tributary in the late afternoon, when the water was running clear and high with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods were beginning their first suggestions of spring green. He had prepared several speeches and discarded all of them, because preparation was the right approach to legal strategy and the wrong approach to saying directly important things to Martha Wells, who would see through prepared speeches immediately and correctly identify them as the thing they were compensating for. He said, "I would like to stop traveling back and forth between Santa Fe and Redemption Creek." She looked at the water. "I have spoken to the Territorial Marshal's office about a district posting," he said. "The South Valley District needs a resident marshal. The position is real and the appointment would be genuine, but the reason I am pursuing it is not primarily professional." "I know," she said. "I want to be here," he said. "With you. I want that to be the fixed point." She turned to look at him with those eyes, dark and direct and clear, and the October assessment was still there. It would always be there. It was part of who she was, but alongside it now was something warmer and more open, the look of a woman who had decided that this particular person was worth being unguarded with. "You are not a simple man to know," she said. "You are contained and careful, and you take a long time to say things." "Yes," he said, "I am aware. I find that I do not mind it." A pause. "I find that I have been waiting for someone who takes things seriously enough to be careful with them." He stepped closer to her. The creek ran beside them, clear and cold, the water that she had fought to keep hers. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, "without complication or condition. I am asking you because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a long career of encountering people, and because I have been in love with you since you laid that document on the table and the entire room stopped." She looked at him for a long moment. The water ran. The cottonwoods moved. "You have been in love with me since before that," she said. "You were in love with me by the second meeting." He almost argued this and then recognized, with a marshal's instinct for correct assessment, that she was right. "Yes," he said. "Then yes," she said. He took her face in his hands and kissed her on the bank of the Millbrook tributary in the April snowmelt light, and she kissed him back without reservation or performance, her hands at the front of his coat again as they had been the first time, certain. They were married in June of 1883 at the Redemption Creek Church, Reverend Aldridge officiating with a joy so evident it altered his usually solemn expression into something that people talked about for years afterward. Martha wore a dress that she had made herself, not white but a deep blue that matched her front door, with her mother's brooch at the collar and her dark hair unpinned for the first time in Hayes's memory, falling past her shoulders in a way that made him stand very still when he first saw her. The entire South Valley came, all the families, the Perezes and the Bowers and the Kellermans and everyone else Martha had served and fought for and held together. and they brought food and music and the specific warmth of a community celebrating one of its own. And old Senora Perez cried from the beginning of the ceremony to the end of the dancing, and Hayes was not above noticing that his own throat was tighter than usual when Martha said "I do." He did say "I do" first, and she said it second, quietly and directly in her characteristic way, and the way she looked at him when she said it was the kind of thing that restructures a man's understanding of what a life can contain. He moved into her house on Sycamore Street because her practice was there and her mother's garden was there, and because the blue door had become, over the course of a year, as close to a definition of home as he had held since childhood. He took the resident marshal posting and learned the district's roads and water and people with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. And in the evenings he came home to the smell of sage and coffee, and whatever Martha was working on at her table, and the specific texture of a life that had someone genuinely intelligent and genuinely present in it. She continued her practice, with no one suggesting otherwise, because anyone who might have suggested otherwise had the good judgment to recognize that the South Valley needed Martha Wells as much after her marriage as before it, and that Marshal Hayes was not the kind of man who would diminish his wife's work. He was, rather, the kind of man who took an interest in it, who read the books on her shelf and asked questions that she found worth answering, who accompanied her on night calls to remote farms when the road was rough and held the lantern, and handed her instruments with a competence that he developed steadily because he paid attention. She made a place in the household records for his marshal's paperwork, which was considerable, and organized it with the same systematic intelligence she brought to her own documentation. And on the several occasions when his federal reports were complimented in the Territorial Attorney General's office for their exceptional clarity and cross-referencing, he said only that he had good assistants, and privately thought that the territorial legal system owed more to Martha Wells than it was ever likely to fully understand. In the winter of 1883, she told him she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday evening while they were both at the work table, he with his marshal's reports and she with a case log, with the directness she brought to significant information of all kinds. He looked up from his report and looked at her face for a moment to make sure he was reading it correctly, and what he saw was clear, a little private, complicated with the awareness of someone who understood the medical dimensions of her own situation better than anyone else, and underneath all of it, warm in a way that moved through his chest like the first real spring day after a difficult winter. He set down his pen and took her hands across the table. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Well," she said, "tired in the mornings, well. Is there anything you need?" She smiled at him, a smile that was reserved and private and entirely his. "I am a healer, Marshal. I know what I need." "Of course you do," he said. "I will ask anyway," she laughed. He had learned over the past months to identify the moment when her composure was going to yield to laughter, the slight shift in the set of her mouth, the brightness that came just before it, and he found that he collected these moments with the thoroughness of a man who recognizes rare things. "You may keep asking," she said. "I do not mind it." Their son was born in August of 1884, on a hot, still night when the stars over the New Mexico Valley were so close and thick you could feel them. Martha delivered him herself with assistance from Senora Perez, who had attended more births than she could count, and who took charge of the domestic logistics with magnificent efficiency, and sent Hayes to the front porch, where he sat for 2 hours that felt like a geological era, and then came back inside when the sound he heard was not the sound that had been tightening his shoulders for 2 hours but a new one, indignant and present and alive. Their son was very small and very definite, with dark hair and eyes that could not yet decide what color they were, and he objected to the world with a vigor that Senora Perez said indicated excellent health and strong character. Martha looked up at Hayes from the bed when he came in, with the exhaustion and the absolute completion of someone who had done an enormous thing, and the look in her eyes when she looked at him over the head of the child was the clearest and most certain thing he had ever been given. "Come and meet your son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child in her arms, very small and very particular and somehow, impossibly, both the most new thing he had ever seen and already familiar. "James," Martha said. "I would like to call him James, after my father." James, Hayes said. He had not known the name was coming. He found that he had no possible objection to it. "James Hayes." "James Catherine Hayes," Martha said. "For my mother." He looked at her. "Catherine, as a middle name. If you have no objection." "I have no objection in the world," he said. He touched his son's hand, the fingers impossibly small and complete, the grip that closed around his finger with a surprising firmness. James Catherine Hayes. James was named correctly. He had dark hair and his mother's composure and, as he grew, his father's capacity for thorough attention. And he was the kind of child who could sit quietly watching his mother work at the herb garden for a full hour, and then ask a question that established he had been paying careful attention to all of it. Martha and Hayes had a good life in Redemption Creek, which is a thing that sounds simple and is not. It is the kind of statement that contains a great deal of specific truth, the accumulation of ordinary days that carry no drama but build, quietly, the architecture of something lasting. The South Valley recovered. The two families who had returned to their land after the territorial judgment rebuilt their operations over 2 years, with help from neighbors and the specific knowledge that the water was secure. 3 new families settled in the district, drawn by the reputation of the valley as a place where small farming had a future. And Martha attended their first births and treated their fevers and learned their names and added them to the network of people who told her things. Because her informant network, as Hayes had once called it, was really just the natural outcome of being present and reliable in a community over time. The Croft Ranch continued to operate on its reduced scale, and Elias Croft himself grew old with what Hayes assessed as a fairly specific kind of unhappy resignation. The fortune still intact, but the expansion stopped. The ambition that had always been his primary characteristic redirected into nothing that satisfied it in the same way. He died in 1890, one of a cardiac episode, and his son, a man of considerably less appetite for domination, sold the North Range holdings to several local families and turned the main operation into a genuinely viable smaller cattle enterprise that got along reasonably well with its neighbors. This was not justice in its full form. It was the kind of partial accounting that the world offered in the absence of perfect systems. Martha noted it, documented it, and moved on, because she had always understood that the work was not to achieve perfect justice in a single action, but to protect and maintain the things that could be protected and maintained, and to add to the record so that the next person fighting the same fight had more to stand on. In 1886, their daughter was born. A girl that time, in the spring, born into a house that already knew how to welcome someone new. They named her Esther, which had been Hayes's mother's name, and she arrived with both her parents' characteristics fully mixed, direct and thoroughly committed to her own opinions from an age that was impressively early. James, who was 2, regarded his sister with the careful assessment of a very small person encountering a large and novel fact, and then apparently decided she was acceptable, and thereafter treated her as a co-investigator of the world rather than a rival to it, which was, Martha told Hayes in the evening after the children were asleep, exactly the right instinct. "He gets that from you," Hayes said. "The assessing gaze." Yes. She was at the work table because she was almost always at the work table in the evenings. The willingness to revise his assessment when the facts change. That is you. He looked at her across the table, this woman he had been married to for 3 years and who continued to be, as she had always been, the most fully interesting person in any room she occupied. "I never revise my assessment of you," he said. She looked up from her work. The lamp was between them, warm and steady, And outside, the October night was exactly as cold and blue and enormous as the October night 3 years ago when he had walked down Sycamore Street for the first time. Because it has always been correct? She asked, with a slight precision that indicated she was teasing him, which she did occasionally and which still arrived as a minor pleasure. Because it was accurate from the beginning, he said. You did not give me anything to revise. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes for a long moment, and what was in them was the accumulated weight of 3 years of ordinary, extraordinary days, the trust of someone who had been self-sufficient by necessity for a long time and had learned, carefully and on her own terms, to share the load with someone who had earned it. Come to bed, she said. The report will be there tomorrow. He put down his pen and came around the table to her, and she took his hand without ceremony, the way she did everything, directly and without performance, and they went to bed in the house where her mother had hidden the document that had started everything, behind the hearth that was still there. The tin box long since moved to the lockbox in Hayes's marshal's office, because the threat that had required hiding it was gone, but the document itself was too important to treat casually. In 1887, the Territorial School Board formally extended the school district to cover the South Valley, something Martha had been pushing for in her quiet, documented way for 4 years. Hayes attended the meeting where it passed and watched his wife listen to the announcement with the contained satisfaction of a person who has been told something they already knew was coming, because they had done the preparatory work themselves. On the walk home, James holding his father's hand on one side and his mother's on the other, and Esther on Hayes's shoulders because she was 18 months old and found walking an inefficient use of time, Martha said, without particular preamble, "My mother would have liked this." The school district, Hayes said. All of it, she said, and her voice had the quality it always had when she spoke about Catherine Wells, clear and private and carrying the particular weight of love that has outlasted its object. The house still standing, the water contract still holding, James, a pause. You, he squeezed her hand. James, alert to adult emotional registers in the way of children with attentive parents, looked up at both of them and apparently found what he saw satisfactory, because he said nothing and went back to studying the road. I think she would have liked you in particular, Martha said. Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that the only thing she ever said about the man I might eventually marry was that he should treat the truth of a thing as if it mattered. She looked at him sideways as they walked. You came to the hearing with the Faro telegraph confirmation. You did not have to do that. The contract was sufficient. The contract was sufficient, Hayes agreed. The confirmation was insurance. It was thorough, she said. It was the act of someone who believes the truth of a thing should be supported at every point where it can be supported. A beat. That was her standard. He thought about Catherine Wells, who had signed a water contract and then kept the witnessed copy in a tin box in the wall and told her daughter 3 times that the man who wants your water will come for the paper first, who had saved a bottle of brandy for an occasion she knew would come and did not live to see. I hope she knew, he said, that the contract would hold. She knew, Martha said, with the certainty of a daughter who had paid attention. That is why she kept it. The New Mexico Territory became a state in 1912, long after the particular chapter of the South Valley had become local history, the kind that older residents told their children not as a cautionary tale, but as a founding story, the document that held the healer who kept it, the marshal who came to help and stayed to be helped in return. Martha Wells Hayes continued her practice until she was past 60. Training 2 apprentices over the years who went on to practice in adjacent districts, transmitting both the medical knowledge and the philosophical disposition of someone who understood that healing was never only about the physical body. Her herb garden grew to encompass the neighboring lot, which Hayes bought for her on the occasion of their 10th anniversary, with the kind of practical romanticism that characterized the gifts he gave, things she would use, and that demonstrated he had been paying attention. The wild olive trees her mother had started were fully established by the time James and Esther were grown, silver-leaved and steady in the New Mexico wind, a long project completed. Hayes served as district marshal for 20 years and then, at 60, handed the badge to a younger man he had trained himself, a serious, careful young man from the Perez family who had grown up knowing that law enforcement in the South Valley meant protecting the people the law was supposed to serve. He then, with the thoroughness he brought to everything, spent several more years helping Martha compile her years of documentation into a set of records that went to the Territorial Historical Society, because Martha believed, and Hayes had come to share the belief, that history documented honestly was itself a form of protection. James Catherine Hayes grew up to become a doctor, properly trained at a medical college, the first in the region to practice what his mother had always argued, that medicine should be accessible to everyone regardless of their ability to pay. He married a woman from Las Cruces who shared his directness and his thoroughness, and who he brought home to Redemption Creek, where Martha looked at her for the assessment interval that anyone who knew Martha recognized, and then said, with the quiet approval that meant more than ceremony, "You had better stay for supper." Esther became a lawyer, which surprised some people and no one who knew her parents. She was direct and thorough and completely committed to her own opinions, and argued her first case before the territorial court at 24 with her mother's documents as precedent, a fact that made Martha sit in the gallery of that courtroom with her hands in her lap and her eyes very bright and completely dry. And in the evenings, in the house on Sycamore Street, where the blue door was 3 coats of paint over the original, but still the same particular shade because Martha had been precise about it, Hayes sat at the worktable across from his wife in the way they had sat since the beginning, with their work between them and the lamp burning and the children grown, and the valley outside settled into the particular piece of a place that has been fought for and held. He would sometimes look up from what he was reading and watch her work, as he had watched her that first afternoon at the mortar, with the same recognition he had felt then but had not yet named, the recognition of exceptional intelligence at rest in its own competence, utterly unperformed, entirely genuine. She would look up eventually and find him watching, and the look she gave him was the same look she had given him that first December evening across the botanical pharmacology text, warm and direct and entirely his. "What?" she would say, in the tone that was not a real question. "Nothing," he would say. "I am looking at you. You have been looking at me for 20 years. "Yes," he said. "I intend to continue." She would look at him for a moment longer, this woman who had been assessed and underestimated, and had outlasted both, who had kept her mother's document in a wall for the years it took for the right moment and the right person to arrive, who had laid it on the table in a crowded room with steady hands and changed everything. Then she would pick up her pen again, and the lamp would burn, and outside the Millbrook tributary would run on in the dark, clear and constant, exactly as it always had, belonging to no one and everyone at once and most specifically, by the force of a witness document and the stubborn intelligence of one woman who understood that the truth of a thing outlasts every attempt to erase it, to the family that had always been its rightful keeper. The stars over the New Mexico Valley were very close and very bright on those evenings, the way they had been on the night James was born, and on the first October Hayes had ridden into the district, and on every night between and after, enormous and permanent above a valley that had been fought for and held and was, in all the ways that mattered, still and always home.